Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, and even if you switched your body up a little, I'm Layman Pascal on behalf of Bruce Alderman and myself and the Integral Stage, and this episode of our Sexuality and Gender series is going to explore the so-called trans issues. These are perennially fascinating since they involve our deep sense of who we are as sexual and social beings, involves our trepidation about evolving into a species that can alter its own structure, involves our ancient anxieties about who gets to show up in what roles in culture, our rational and our irrational fears about what's natural and unnatural, and also the kinds of magical agency that seem to be involved in transforming ourselves. The contemporary political situation makes explorations of this kind particularly salient. And I think, to pull back a little, one way to think about the integrative worldview that we're coming from on this program is to think of it as a big picture and a big history. But another way to think about it is as a methodology and an orientation toward exploring nuance and enriching the material out of which we form and deepen our senses of self, community, and world. So here to help us nuance things by sharing her developmental journey and its philosophical implications and its current political context is Rebecca Prentice, who participated in the Philosophy Portal's recent exploration of the integral stage and its discontents. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
Why don't you tell us something about who you are?
Oh, geez, that's such a big, wide place to start. So I would say that I'm a very oh, now I'm all nervous. I really would say that if there's one thing that people could know about me that would probably sort of say a lot is that I'm silly. I'm a silly goose and I enjoy nonsense. And I also enjoy kind of those moments of coincidence where meaning kind of like bursts onto the scene from a series of happenstance. I'm reminded of this one moment where I saw an ice cream that was like fell on the floor and was melted. And I was like, oh my God, that's like life right there, you know? That life is this kid's, I imagined a kid, they dropped their ice cream. And I'm like, man, that's like the whole world in that moment, which sounds absurd. It sounds absurd. But like, you have moments like these, I think, and almost like Lynchian sort of dreamlike moments. But anyway, so that if you want to understand me, I'm very silly and I love Lynchian dreamlike moments.
I also love Lynchian dreamlike moments. I don't know how silly or not silly I am. I think you are for people who are listening, you're a philosophically and to some degree psychoanalytically informed silly goose who brings I want to say like a leading edge and depth oriented sensibility of some kind to your appreciation of the strange moments and the meaningful moments of super salient, super relevant weirdness that infest all of our lives.
Yeah, that's a pretty good description, actually. That's much better than the way I said it, actually. You should write for my brain. Like, I'll hire you.
Okay. Is that a real job? I could do that. Let's begin with your story. So, like, over the course of your life, you must have gone through phases and realizations and insights and perceptions relative to how you experience your identity, how you relate to gender and sexuality, et cetera, in order to end up where you are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us a sense of the journey and the stages that got you here?
Yeah, but I think that in order to really to both understand, at least for me, because prefacing everything I'm going to say, I cannot speak for everyone who transitions. I'm of the firm belief that while there might be varying common tendencies in terms of developmental patterns for trans people of different kinds, there probably isn't a one size fits all story or narrative. So just prefacing everything I'm going to say with like this applies to me and maybe some people, but cannot be generalized in the a broad or naive sense. So to start that off, would suggest that we begin not chronologically, because at least for me, the way that this sort of change in identity itself occurs is, in a sense, nonlinear or retroactive. So, starting things off, there was a period roughly 3 years ago where me and my fiance, and that's a whole nother story, actually. I have a fiance. She is a woman. I transitioned from man to woman. We were in a straight relationship. That's a whole nother topic that we could. But anyway, sorry. I have ADHD. Not a good excuse. Um, so starting about 3 years ago, there was a particular moment where me and my fiance were like, all right, we're gonna go to a goth club and I'm gonna try cross-dressing for fun, right? Because if there's any place in the world where you could get away with cross-dressing and it would just be for fun, it's gonna be a goth club. And so during that period, which by the way is a week after I tried making my own ayahuasca, which I did on my own at a low dose, so I didn't get the full, like, completely knocked out of reality effect. But it did leave me in a kind of very emotionally open and vulnerable space for the next week afterwards. So it's worth mentioning. I went to the thrift store, got some women's clothing, went ahead and tried them on, and I experienced this feeling of seeing myself in women's clothing and thinking that I looked beautiful and that I really liked this, that it felt, I don't know, have you ever worn like a nice suit and you're like, damn, I look good? You ever felt that?
Yeah, and
Huh?
actually, I've dressed as a woman a couple of times and enjoyed it. Felt kind of energized and liberated by that, but didn't have that same feeling that I had about seeing myself in certain masculine styles of
Mm.
costuming.
So yeah, like that, it's very similar. It's very similar. But the intensity of it for me in that moment was pretty unique and jarring, even. It was a little bit unexpected. What's even more strange is that that glee at a sense of my own sort of like being sort of bewildered by the beauty I was capable of in this sort of attire slowly slipped into this is perfect, this is so right, except for one thing, the person in the outfit. Something's not right with that. It switched to this. And I would say and we'll backtrack in a second to get the chronological story, but it's at that moment that what I think is generally considered gender dysphoria proper started for me. So it's not like it was a consistent, lifelong sort of affective disruption. It was after this moment seemed to create a certain kind of, or act as a type of event, if you know, like in the Badiouan sense, like this rupture of the impossible becoming possible and the reorganization of one's kind of like symbolic universe. And so it's from that point that the gap between how I appeared and how I would have liked to appear, or the sort of image of me as a woman, which had sort of come into its own, almost as like an alien thing to some extent. Um, Sort of that gap, that distance became a pain and a wound. And a lot of transition, at least for me, there's a lot of things to it, but on some fundamental level, I would say that, especially now at this point where I'm doing great, by the way. like I don't have gender dysphoria at this point. And the most dysphoria I have is like, when you're like, oh, my nose is too big, like that general body like thing that everyone kind of has, like that. But a lot of my transition has been centered around, I guess you could say, suturing the wound or healing the wound in some sense. And at this point, there is no gap between the person the image that sort of came into being in and through me and my appearance in the mirror. So there's a sort of peace there now. So
Mm.
going backwards now, yes, throughout my life, I had varying feelings about being a man or being a woman. As a very small child, for instance, probably like 5 years old, I do remember thinking to myself, man, I would have preferred to have been born a woman. That would have been ideal. I don't know why I didn't like being a boy. And also, in general, I had issues with men. Like, I thought men were like bad. I feel like this is like a side effect of like maybe post second wave feminism that had seeped into the 90s culture. And I wonder if I was picking up on that on some unconscious level. And I somehow felt men were associated with violence, aggression, creepiness, all this other stuff, right? And I really didn't want to be that. I didn't want to grow into that. I had in particular, there's this one dream I remember having where it was like everything was like black and white. I was a small child. There was a basin of water or pool of water on the floor. And I'm not sure if someone lowered me or if I lowered myself, but my arm was lowered into the water. And when it raised out of the water, it was like hairy and muscular and very masculine. And I freaked out and I woke up and I was like in a cold sweat and I was like, ha! It's awful. Don't know what that says, but it seems to be related on some level. Some fear of becoming masculine. As I grew up, there's other things too. Like my dad used to give me old T-shirts that were for like I would use to go to bed, right? But they were enormous T-shirts for a small child. And I used to treat them like a dress because I thought it was like nice and cute. And I very much wanted to be cute. I very much wanted to be cute and beautiful as a child. In fact, I have a particular memory of me going to my brother and being like, I think I look cute. And he was like, what? No, you're ugly. And I'm like, oh, I guess, I guess that's how it is, huh? And so then puberty, there were periods where I was like, when I started having body hair, I didn't like it. I thought it was that I really would say I had some kind of gender dysphoria there. Around puberty, some kind of gender dysphoria around certain masculine traits began to emerge. But also, I was dealing with other body-related issues based on my weight. Like, I actually grew up obese, and it's of my opinion that growing up in an obese body, it affects your sense of gender identity on some level. I've seen both men and women affected by this. Um, and also, what's interesting about having an obese body is that you have a lot of excess body fat, and a lot of excess body fat can sometimes, if you're male, strike someone as effeminate, right? And I actually remember uh, there were periods as a teenager where, for whatever reason, I still don't understand, is I wanted breasts. I don't know why. It wasn't like it wasn't like a sexual fetish, because goodness knows, as a teenage boy, there's lots of other things. There's lots of things to do on the internet, but that wasn't one of them, actually. That wasn't one of them, which is interesting. And there was at least one time I remember actually like being in bed and crying at night and like wanting breasts. It's such a strange thing to recall because it's hard to place it in context, as just sort of a fragment of something you remember. But it's there. And yet, through this whole time, I never really thought of transitioning because as a child, I didn't know about the idea of transitioning one's gender. I knew about transsexuals. And for me, it was all about, oh, they like truly believe they're a woman in a man's body or a man in a woman's body. And like, they are somehow they have a mismatched sense of their gender identity and their relationship to their body. And this is just a sort of thing to allow them to cope and live their life without having to deal with the distress that it causes them. And oftentimes, when talking about transsexuals, it all focuses around the idea of the surgery. So for me, all of that seemed rather different and something I couldn't really relate to. But it was fascinating to me. I remember watching a documentary on it on like Discovery Channel or something and being like, whoa, that's really interesting. Um, but interestingly enough, too, like when it comes to genitals, this is an interesting thing. Like as a kid, I actually did. I hated having male genitalia. But then I saw women's genitalia and I was like, well, that just looks horrible too. They're all just horrible. So like that never bothered me because it was like, you know what, it all kind of looks like weird stuff. So genitals are just weird. But it strikes me that I was quite uncomfortable with it. At least until I realized there was nothing to be comfortable about genitals with. Um, and So eventually went through periods where once transgender became a thing, I started thinking more about like, well, what am I? What is my gender? How do I relate to myself? See, I'd always been disassociated from the sense of being a man. It had always been something that felt like it was somewhat alien to me, something I couldn't quite relate to. I couldn't quite relate to the other guys. A lot of my friends were women, although they were tomboys, so they weren't exactly the girly girls. Um, but when I was around guys, it's like, there's sort of like a way that guys will give each other shit. They'll be kind of like faux aggressive with each other. They'll play these games of pecking order that are like only half serious most of the time. And like, I never knew how to participate in that. Now, whether or not that has to do with not being synced into masculinity or me just being socially awkward and weird is like a whole nother question. But I never quite felt like I fit into that world. And I never quite felt like I fit into that model. At one point, I really feel as though I almost came up with, on my own, Judith Butler's performativity theory just because I spent so much time thinking about it. This is like in my early 20s, late teens, like 19, 20. And I was thinking about how, okay, so I don't actually relate to being a man in my essence, in my core. However, I still perform, I still appear as a man and appear as a man for others. And regardless of whether or not I can relate to the idea of being a man in myself, I still can have a relationship to other people's perception of me as a man. And it's not only that, I can still leave an impression of what is possible as the role of man. Like I create a certain horizon of possibilities for other men about what men can be, right? And so I'm like, I'm still responsible for my appearance as a man in the world. Even though I can't really feel it, I can't see it, it has an effect on other people. And there's like something to sort of relate to through that. So which, kind of reads pretty close to performativity in Judith Butler, in Butler's sense. Not exactly, but this idea of metaphysical essence being sort of an illusion produced by the repetition of performativity is like kind of around the wheelhouse I was thinking at that time. So at that point, I basically, and that's like 21, 22, 20, something around there. At that point, once I had that realization, I was like, okay, I'm kind of done with this. I'm like, all right, like I don't really feel like a guy, but like this is where I'm at. I have a sort of alienated relationship to it, and it's still a relationship to it, and there's no evidence to the contrary. There's no like, well, some deep down truth that I can discover through just internal inquiry. So it's like, all right, we'll leave it at that. And that was never that conviction or that calmness about it was shaken every once in a while, maybe a little bit, but never so severely that like it really caused any serious disruption of my life. Until, that moment I mentioned at the beginning of all of this. All it took to undo, because that's like the 21 years old to 31 years old. All it took to undo all those years, that like, what is that, over a decade or like almost a decade, something like that. All that year of being totally stable in my identity and self-assured with where I was at. That whole time, that whole period, undone in literally a day. Like all it took was putting on a dress, and all of a sudden, all of that gone, completely wiped away. And what's funny too is that because I had been talking to my fiance about doing this, and just like a week or several weeks, or maybe like a month actually, prior to me actually going and trying getting the clothes to carry out the plan, I actually had a dream, which is a very was what's the word? I'm forgetting. There's a word for telling of the future.
Precognitive?
No, not that kind of telling of the future, like literary term.
Oh,
Uh,
foreshadowing?
yeah, it's like foreshadowing. Yes, thank you. That was perfect. So I had a dream where it was just me going about my life and my day, except kind of in the background of everything was a female version of myself. And that female version of myself, and it's funny because this almost sounds like it's too good, like it's too pertinent, like it should be, like it would be in a, like it'd be cheesy in a movie. It would be cheesy in a movie if this happened. But at one point I spoke to this female version of myself that had just sort of been watching the whole time and was like, basically they said something like, when is it going to be my turn?
Mm.
And that was the dream. There's only one other dream I had like this, which is when I was a teenager. I had a dream where I just had a normal day as a girl with dark green hair for some reason. And then at the very end of the dream, I encountered this Wizard of Oz like figure that said, this is just a dream. This isn't real. You have to wake up. And I woke up and I was like kind of sad and disappointed. Like, so it's in terms of how did I get here? One of the most succinct ways I think I can sort of like sum this up is that there was something about being able to actually see the real possibility of how I could be in a more feminine mode of presentation and embodiment that sort of synced up with a series of moments throughout my life which had never been like sort of brought together and linked, which had all been sort of idiosyncrasies in their own respect. But through that event and through that decision, which by the way, and I could maybe go into this separately, I'm not sure because it'd be a difficult for me to like work through it. But there's like this really strong like ethics of desire like component to the decision I made to actually pursue this. I was reading Alenka Zipancic and Zizek for years prior to me actually deciding to transition. And a lot of their work actually had some role in the way I thought about what I was doing. Rather than say Butler or queer theory or anything like that. I was never really into queer theory. I was pretty disassociated from the whole queer world, and honestly, I still kind of am. But so it's more through psychoanalysis, through philosophy that I thought about these things. And the decision to actually follow through on this desire that had emerged definitely came from an sort of ethical sort of place. It wasn't like just like oh, I'm just going to go do this.
Okay,
um,
so there's a ton of fascinating pathways in all of what you've related so far.
mm,
I think what I'd like to start with first is just the form of the telling of it. It's really interesting that you want to start non-chronologically with this event and then work backwards from there. And you referenced Badiou, and I'm a big fan of Badiou, who I consider to be a legitimate meta theorist in like the integral sense of the term.
mm,
And he has this sense of right. You can never fully be sure about the event because the event is not substantiated by the existing encyclopedia of the world. In some ways, it's something you have to gamble on, you take a risk on. But when you do that, your possibility to be a real subject, to be a real being, is intensified, and then you can retroactively find the justifications for that. But I think that's a very sophisticated way to think about this, a very complex way to think about this,
mm,
because a lot of the trans people I deal with have seemed to rely very heavily and prioritize the chronological telling, as if the justification for what they're doing is found only in the fact that they experienced it all the way along as a kind of linear narrative. And they don't want to think about a later event or a retrospective reshaping of the interpretation as if that might injure the validity of the claim that they're making.
Mm.
What's your sense of the of that particular thing, of the tendency among other trans people to want to rely on the developmental chronology first and not focus so much on the gamble of the event?
That's a really, really good question. And there's actually a whole history to that. In terms of relying on the chronological narrative, like in the past, there was a period in time where like you couldn't even get hormones unless you had a lifelong story of having always been like, oh, I'm in the wrong body, you know? Like I've been suffered my entire life of being feeling as though I were a girl in a boy's body or a boy in a girl's body. And don't get me wrong, I have no doubt that that is the case for some people. Absolutely, 100%. I can very easily imagine how, as a small child, instead of thinking to yourself like I did, "Well, I would have preferred to have been a girl." I can see someone who could have thought, I really am a girl and like something's wrong, you know? I can see that. But also, there is something, there is a fear that without a this this gets tricky. I see. This is under theorized on my part. I know the history, right? I know why this is something that people used to do because it was part of the legitimization narrative to actually get access to medical care. But at the same time, it is there's something about it which I think for people feels more legitimizing, but it's also possible that this whole retroactivity thing that I'm describing really does take place, but that the retroactive nature of it cannot be thought, like is not effectively thought through. Like I could very easily have taken all of those moments I mentioned throughout my childhood and been like and told it from the perspective starting at, well, when I was 5 years old, I wish I'd been born a girl, and I could have started with that, and I could have created that narrative that made it sound like it was from the past that this what I did was justified. But like, and I could believe that too. I could have narrativized that too when I was first starting. In fact, it crossed my mind that possible reorganization of my own internal narrative had crossed my mind, and but I couldn't, having read Zizek, having learned about like retroactivity, about understanding like how non-linear the functioning of the symbolic order over time, or the functioning of the signifier over time, right? You know, like when you make a sentence and the last word in the sentence completely changes the meaning of the sentence. Being exposed to these sorts of logics, I could not help but be aware of the way that the present has an impact on the past. And so, if someone has no concept of retroactivity and nonlinear thinking in terms of the signification, then I don't think it's going to be very easy to come to that kind of conclusion about their own internal narrative. So that's one possible example. It's just that maybe it is more common than it seems, but it's hard to recognize as what it is because it actually sets up the possibility of like repressing the nonlinear nature of it.
Yeah, the repression of a nonlinear is really interesting. And I think for a lot of people, when you gamble, when you retroactively gamble on the event, in some ways, you're gambling that it is really real. You're gambling that it's not dependent retroactively upon the event, right? You're saying it's more real than that. My gamble is precisely that it is a reality.
I mean, this
But
this
there may
is
be different ways to hold that. Like there may be
mm,
some people who are more cognitively capable of holding a frame in which they can inspect that without undermining it, and other people whose cognitive style is such that to inspect the fact of the retroactive gamble of the event would sort of sabotage the meaning making
yeah,
that they're doing.
yeah. And also, I would just say that in general, in our culture, thinking linearly is how justification works, right? Even when people think about learning, they think about learning in terms of building on a foundation of knowledge that you then add to, that's additive, right? But that the foundation, the root, is the justification for the whole rest of it. But I don't think knowledge necessarily works that way, right? Like, once again, just going back into the whole retroactivity thing, there's a part in, and I haven't read the whole book. I used this for an essay of mine, but Zizek wrote in Less Than Nothing about Deleuze's use of retroactivity, and he talked about, who was it? Some person, I don't remember who now, a famous author. I'm so disappointed in myself. Um, they said that every great artist basically creates their own predecessors, right? That every addition to the set of art actually reintroduce like changes the history of art and the history or of writing of literature, changes its legacy with it with the addition, because they are now all seen, the past is seen again anew from the present, which then also changes the present in the context of the past that has been changed by the present, right? So, and there's other places in terms of knowledge, like when we think of science, how much science was done on water without knowing it was H2O? Like, how much early science was done thinking about the movement of the planets without realizing the sun was the center of the earth? Or how much science was done on vision and the way light works without knowing that our eyes don't shoot beams at things, Like, so retroactivity like has a really interesting effect because we can see now how what they were doing then actually has logics to it that do make sense in the present context, but we understand it differently and what they were doing differently from where we are now. So like this nonlinear mode of knowledge, of self-knowledge even, is something that um, is not the common way of, I think, approaching the way that signification and meaning sort of emerges, right?
Another thing that comes up for me that I find really intriguing here is the question of distance. So you were talking about going through a phase where your sense of being man was not being based on your internal sensing of an authenticity of being a man, but was based on performing a role. So there's a kind of ironic distance, right? There's a kind of performative play acting. You go, this is valuable, but I'm doing it as performance.
Mhm.
Now, when it comes to the current identity as a woman, what's the degree of performativity or irony or distance involved, right? Is it the same? Is it lessened? How identified or not identified are you relative to performing as woman?
That's that's a really interesting question. I would say that there isn't, it's qualitatively different. But there is still a certain kind of, I think, distance, or more precisely, not so much distance, right? I think that the best way to describe it is that the difference between my performance, like as a man, the distance was between my performance as a man external to me and my somehow true essence, which seems to be indescribable or seems to be unclear or whatever. Now it's more like it's my external performance and my own personal relationship to it, not just through other people's perception of me, which honestly, other people's perception of me is the more vague, unclear thing now at this point. Whereas as a man, other people's perception of me seemed very clear. People sent me a very strong message of how they perceived me and how they felt around me. Whereas now it's like, it's more murky. It's like, what am I to you is a question. I'm very hysterical about this. I'm like, what do you see me as? Am I beautiful to you? Am I a monster to you? Am I weird or am I cool? Am I funny? Like, I'm not sure. Um, but the distance also exists in a different way because it's like there is no essence that's unclear or that I can't relate to the external sort of embodiment and performance. Rather, there is like just an emptiness. There's just a nothing. So the real like instead of between my essence and how I appear on the outside, it's between my non-essence and how I appear on the outside, if that makes any sense. But there is still the alienation in terms of how the other sees me, which seemed more certain before.
That's really intriguing because there's a so one of the models that people use to think about developmental psychology is that they say the subject becomes the object of the new subject by inspecting itself. There's a kind of reflective recursion involved in these models of cognitive hierarchical development, so that at each stage identity is sort of decentered, right? You're concentrated in this identity, and then there's an expansion. And the what I heard in your story there was a sort of the decentering of the ambiguity of identity. It's moved from being at the core of the event to something that's in the relationship with the other. So like one
Mm.
way to think about that is was there was a flip between where it was positioned, but another way to think is basically the world space in which the ambiguity is located has gone from this big to sort of that big to out there.
Right.
That's
Because
intriguing.
there isn't now like a core, a kernel that's more real now. Right.
Yeah.
You know. But in some sense, the the if we might say the masquerade, if you know like the feminine masquerade sort of idea. The external appearance is more concrete, actually, right? At least my relationship to it, right, is more concrete than it used to be.
I'm okay. This is a guess. Um, you're trans American and philosophical. Are you a Natalie Wynn Contra Points fan?
I would say that I have enjoyed quite a few of ContraPoints' videos, and I think she's an interesting character, and but like I don't know if I would call myself a fan so much. I would say that I think she's pretty cool, and she everything she like. Oh my God, the production value on her videos is through the roof. Um, and some of her the points that she makes are a lot more complex and nuanced than some you might get from somewhere else. But yeah, like I'm a Natalie Wynn Points enjoyer for sure.
Okay.
I don't know if I call myself a fan.
Let's talk a little bit about the general social situation that's going on. So we've got the second Trump administration in the United States. It's obviously chaotic. The Canadians are watching it. That's where I am, being
Mm.
unsure of how we stand. No one seems to be sure of where they're standing or what's bluff and what's truth, but they seem to be taking some definite actions to satisfy the segment of the population that is anxious about trans in the military, trans on sports teams, trans in locker rooms, that kind of thing. What's your impression of the recent changes? How have they affected you personally or not? And what are you anticipating over the next 4 years?
I would say that definitely when it first happened, the first executive order defending women from gender ideology extremism. What a title. Also, the defending women part is always interesting because like it's very patronizing and kind of what's it called? Like I wouldn't want to say exactly patriarchal, but like it's that sort of like protective father kind of authority figure voice. Um,
Paternalistic.
yeah, there we go. It's very paternalistic. Um, and like when I first saw that, I was like, oh shit, like this is it's real. Because all the trans people that I follow like on Instagram, they're all like, oh, Trump is coming, the fascism is here, we're all gonna get rounded up, it's a trans genocide. That's like that's a very real fear that floats around. And not every trans person on Instagram has been that extreme about it, but that is in the air, right? And me personally, I've always I could go on for my whole political history. I mean, like, I used to be an anarchist, and for a while I was a wannabe communist, and now I don't know if I'm post-left or what, but um, uh, I have my takes. I'm not like Democrat Republican brained, you know. Like I think in a bit more of a broader perspective on what's going on. I had thought from the beginning that as radical as Trump was in some ways, especially just in terms of like social norms and culture, that like he's not actually that extreme. He's a pretty moderate in terms of what his actual like what is he actually doing or what has he actually done? Like it wasn't that crazy. The country didn't like completely change when he was elected the first time. And I was not super worried. I was really, when he first got elected, I was thinking, oh, well, for one thing, I wasn't trans at the time, but I was thinking, oh, this is actually maybe an opportunity for the left to sort of like reorganize itself around this. And of course, they did, but in like a not great way. And now, though, something definitely feels different. Something feels different about where we're at now. I don't know if I'm ready to go ahead and say that like now is the moment of the rise of fascism. I don't think I'm ready to say that. I feel as though a lot of this still seems to me to be for bluff and for public appeal. But the rhetoric that's come out has been pretty rough. I mean, if you look at the executive order, the first one, the defending women one, like it basically says trans people don't exist. Trans people are an ideological phantasm that like is the product of people's mental illness, and that there isn't even man and woman. There's only male and female. Also, just the way that they define male and female as like what is it? It's gametes gamete size at conception, which is actually stupid because males at conception don't have like their gonads are the same as females, so they doesn't really mean anything. I guess everyone's a woman now. But the the really just like worrying thing for me is if trans people don't exist and you can't change sex and they want to cut medical funding for this sort of stuff, will I lose access to hormones? Another issue is if trans people don't exist, then protections from discrimination don't exist for people who don't exist. And that's part of the bill. So, like for instance, if I were to be discriminated against in the workplace on the grounds of being transgender, that's a non-issue from that executive order's perspective. Not only that, it reaffirms that uh, people have the right to single-sex spaces being exclusively for that single sex, and that they can file a lawsuit with the government to protect that right, which means that there's like it's incentivizing the possibility that say I worked at Home Depot. I don't work there anymore, but if I still worked at Home Depot and I went to use the women's restroom and an employee didn't like that I was using the women's restroom and they decided to file suit against the company with the government, then like the company is incentivized, one, to not let me use the women's bathroom, and two, to not hire me to begin with, so it's not a problem. That's rather bleak if that like were to fully actualize itself in like the way that workplaces actually function. Um, Another big issue is just like some of the language that was used in another bill. Like there's the military ban. That like really shocked me. I don't have you seen that? The language in that?
Um, I've seen news articles about it, but I haven't explored the specific language.
Let me just read this for a second. It's short, but I think you'll get an idea of why this is quite offensive. Consistent with the military mission and long-standing DoD policy, expressing a false gender identity divergent from an individual's sex cannot satisfy the rigorous standards necessary for military service. Beyond the hormonal and surgical medical interventions involved, Adoption of a gender identity inconsistent with an individual's sex conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle, even in one's personal
Oh,
life. A man's assertion that he is a woman and his requirement that others honor this falsehood is not consistent with the humility and selflessness required of a service member.
that's intriguing. So, on the one hand, there's this really gross element, which is we can't have liars. And if you're doing this, you're a liar. Although there's all kinds of other deception they're tolerating for all kinds of other reasons. On the other hand, from a developmental standpoint, there's a certain kind of simplification that it's suggesting, right? That we don't want any complexity, and that there's a I mean, this is one of the things I get from what I think of as regressive sort of pseudo right wing. I wouldn't even call it an actual right wing phenomenon. It's more like a degenerate thing, posing as the right wing. But it gets kind of turned on by the sense of empowerment that would it get by eradicating things from consideration. If there are fewer things to be concerned about, then you can feel somehow more immediately and more superficially empowered. Just
Mm.
like if I ignored a whole bunch of things, if I emotionally ignored a whole bunch of things, I would have a more streamlined, happier life. Now, there would be collisions down the road, and there would be all kinds of ethical significance to me ignoring those things. But I kind of get it from that point of view, that kind of perverse enjoyment of if we fall back on older, simpler, reified definitions, then
Yeah.
we can feel we've got this extra jazz in ourselves.
Yeah, and you can
Um,
see that in the
yeah.
way that, like, if you ever look at like people who don't like trans people when they post online, and they post on trans people's like stuff on Instagram or on Twitter or whatever, it's always like, haha, you're a man. Haha, you're a woman. Like that, and it's usually really, really blunt. It always reduces basically down to that and tries to ignore the whole like reflective gap between being a body and seeing yourself as a body, being a man and seeing yourself as a man, like, and also like seeing being in yourself what you are as well as opposed to what you are for others. Like, there's a lot of complex reflexive moments that have to be processed in order for identity in that sort of way to actually function. And for most people, you can take that for granted, right? Like, you can just kind of take for granted these things. You usually, it's through some sort of like spiritual development or work that you are forced into like really thinking about it. Or like, let's say you're a man and you get into a relationship, a serious relationship, and you start thinking, well, what kind of man am I for her, right? Or if you become a father and you think, what kind of a man am I for my child? And then you start thinking, well, about what it means to you to be a man, maybe. Or when you're a teenager and you're first sort of figuring it out and you're like, well, how do I actually like be an adult? Which always includes, how do I be a man? How do I be a woman? And so all of those things, which can be assumed to simply be intuitive, when looked at closely, they're not. They never really are. And people's sense of what it means to be a man or woman is always sort of follows from certain models. Like, I can't tell you how many guys I know who, like, on some deeply embedded level, they're cowboys. Like, they wouldn't say it, but like the cowboy is like such a part of their identity. And it's like maybe it's not conscious for them, but like you can feel it in the way they act, the way they lean back on something, it's there. So everyone's sort of borrowing these models to make sense of themselves. There is this reflexive gap that is what creates this sort of need for modeling. Because weirdly enough, right, your physical sex does not really tell you a lot about what you're supposed to do with being that physical sex. It's the social world around you and all of the people in it that sort of inform you on that.
It's an interesting thing for me. I feel sort of like on the one hand, I have this sense. I imagine a hardcore Islamic cleric comes to the West and can't believe the way we're allowing women to display sexualized versions of themselves in their public dress sense, because he imagines a culture in which that's an an open request for a sexual assault or something like that,
Mm,
right? And what you want to say back to that person is, no, no, this is it's a means of production for a more complex civilization where your constant encounter with the ambiguity of stimulations forces you to become a more sophisticated being, and we want a civilization of more sophisticated beings. So
mm,
that whether if we try to diminish the ambiguity and the creative decision making involved in these ambiguities, then we end up regressing. And if we allow it, we end up challenging ourselves forth to become a more sophisticated system. So
mm,
half of me thinks that. The other half of me is deeply sympathetic to just how much extra time and extra work and extra energy that takes, and how exhausting it can be to try to factor more variables and more ambiguities into account. And
mm,
my sense is that a lot of people, maybe particularly in the United States at this time, feel exhausted, feel overwhelmed, and are desperate for some kind of simplification that could take some of the complexity off their plate for them.
mm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. It definitely, there's so much. That's another like interesting thing just for me to think about is this problem of like, there's so much to worry about for people. It's like I can totally get why they don't feel the need to worry about the gender stuff. Like it seems so out of left field. Uh, let's see. I was like pun intended maybe. Uh, so out of left field compared to like where we're at, where they might actually be at in their daily lives, right? Like there, I don't think most people think of masculinity and femininity and like gender identity as something that is like an active or important crisis at the moment. I would argue maybe it is, but it's not how people experience it. Um, I think the most people experience is just the problem of dating and the problem of the relations between men and women at the level of like broader society. But I don't think most people see that as pertaining to issues of gender identity and sex. They just take it as a given, like, oh, men are like this, women are like this, and yeah, there's conflict, but that's as old as time, which is maybe, but different conflicts at different times, and why do they appear this way or that way? But anyway, so like just wanting to simplify the world and to really narrow it down to like the things that you at least consciously experience as directly impacting you. Definitely sympathetic to that. Um, Even like for instance, like something I noticed, and I realized I didn't fully answer this, but like maybe I did. Like so when the executive orders happened, I kind of freaked out for a minute because I just wasn't sure exactly how it's going to affect me. But I knew its potential, right? I live in Southern California, so I might be protected from even the worst of this, so long as sanctuary states uphold are allowed to do what they do by the federal government. Um, but like, there's like, I can't get my gender changed anymore on my ID. I got the court document. I just waited forever to actually change my ID and other documents. So now I'm screwed up. I've heard some people who've actually had their ID or birth certificate taken from them because of the government being like, we're not sure, like we have to sort this out and we'll get back to you when we sort this out. It's like they don't have a passport or they don't have their ID, which is like horrible, scares me. But like, damn, I was going somewhere with this. Sorry. Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that one of the things that was interesting to me is that even the like I freaked out for like a minute and I calmed down because it's way more ambiguous than it seems just by looking at the executive orders. They could all get shot down by a judge. It's really up in the air at this point. And even if they aren't, then the next president comes in, it could all be wiped away. So it's like hard to say what to actually worry about. But what I noticed is that like generally I've seen people being quiet about this stuff. And on some level I'm like I'm actually kind of sympathetic to that, but also it was kind of worrying at first. It's like I would have thought that like say left liberal progressive types that this would be like on the radar. This would be one among the many things that they are like uh, shouting in the face of the coming fascism of the current administration. Or I'm using their way of framing things.
Mhm.
Um, but they weren't. I hardly saw anything actually, as far as like in my immediate bubble of the world and in my family's immediate bubble of the world. So, and part of that I wonder is if like I feel as though like the whole woke thing like has that wave has crashed. I feel like the idea that you can just jump on the bandwagon with whatever oppressed group is dealing with whatever shit, and you can like get a certain kind of social capital out of that, or that you can feel like a virtuous warrior from that. Like I don't think it's worth what it used to be. I think that some of the value in that has sort of cashed out at this point. Um, so it seems to me as though a lot of people have narrowed their focus in the US to thinking about the DEI measures and the immigration stuff. Like I think those are the loudest points currently in the US that are like being made. That's where a lot of public attention is going to. And while there still is attention going to the transgender stuff, there's not a lot. And in some sense, I feel like this is not just from the right, but even from like, say, the center left or whatever. There is also this wanting for things to be simpler. Because I think it's very overwhelming, at least in the imaginary world, like in one's imagination, what's going on right now. And simplifying things to like a handful of issues that you can really nail down onto seems to be what people are doing.
Do you think um, a slogan like trans women are women has, on the whole, been more helpful or unhelpful to trans people?
Uh, oh. So for me, I would say that I feel like people would roast. I feel like I like on the back of my mind, I have this trans superego, this trans community superego that like wants to like attack me for saying this. But like I have found that phrase to be obnoxious. Like, look, I get it. I get it. And for some people, they need to hear that. I understand why they might need to hear that, you know? But like, it's a flattening. It is a flattening of things. I don't think like we can have it's an open discussion as to how under the umbrella of woman I fit into that. You know, that's an open question to me. Um, but that question entails thinking about, well, what exactly is the umbrella? Like, what is that category at the highest point, right? In the broadest sense, and how do we think about it in such a way that I'm included or not included, right? But that's an open question. When you say trans women are women without any further qualifications, without any further explanations, it is a really intense kind of flattening of the field. And generally, I experience it as patronizing from, like, say, the liberal left or the liberal progressives, essentially because they might say that, but do they mean it? Right? Like, do they really mean it? Like, that's kind of up in the air. It's hard to say whether that's true or not. I mean, me personally, I'm not even sure if I could say that without like having some doubts. And if I'm not sure if I can say that with having some doubts, how can someone who's like who hasn't spent like years of their life like in turmoil over these questions and of like deeply digging into them and thinking about them, how can they say that without any doubt when I'm over here and I've gone through all of this work of trying to understand how all these things fit together and what it means, and I would say something like that and I'd have doubts. I'd be unsure if that's really an accurate like phrase that captures everything. So, but also there's another angle to this. For people who are currently going through, especially the early phases of transition, there is a really intense fragility of the ego and a really intense fragility of your sense of identity. And I know that for me, for myself, at any given moment, I could be like, am I even really trans? Did I just make this up? Is any of this real? Which on weirdly enough, often in my worst spirals during those early days, it didn't lead back to, am I really a man still?
Hmm.
What it led back to was, do I even exist? Am I real? Which is interesting. It's interesting that that's the place where my mind went when it fell into the deepest pits. It wasn't, oh, I'm actually a man pretending I'm a woman. It's, I'm actually nothing. I'm actually totally non-existent. I'm unreal. That derealization, that feeling of like disassociation and like that's where it leads to. That's where it leads to for me. So for someone who is dealing with that kind of fragility and that kind of disassociative relationship to their own sense of identity and being in the world as an embodied being, like hearing something like, no, you're valid, trans women are women, all that sort of stuff, that can be very comforting. And maybe that's what you need during that time. But, I'm at a place where I'm pretty secure in myself and like that's not good enough. That's nice it was nice for a period where I was fragile, but like I'm not fragile anymore. And I want to know. I want to understand, which requires complexity and it requires nuance. Just one last issue on that phrase, is that I also think that this, because it's such a flattening phrase, because it's such a, like, I know what's right, this is what's right, you need to accept what's right. I feel like it puts people into an awfully defensive position if they have doubts about that phrase, right? So if you're like, no, I know what a woman is, and that ain't it, you'd have a pretty hard time telling that to them and convincing them that what you're saying is meaningful. In fact, you're more likely to convince them that you're trying to brainwash them. And I feel like that's where some of the people on the right or some of the more conservative types of folks, I feel like that's the kind of like resistance and affective like response they get to that kind of way of talking, where there's no option for questioning, there's no option for thinking or talking about it. And you're just expected to sort of accept these truisms and shut up. And that's like asking for aggression in some level, I think.
I feel like there's a complex inquiry around why this is a pertinent social topic at Flashpoint. So for most people, because it's not like trans is a rampant phenomenon necessarily. Trans and transition is a small segment of the population, and a lot of the people who feel very concerned about it have no personal experience or knowledge of it whatsoever. So the question of why it's in the public radar so strongly is really intriguing, right? And it could be because digital media and the algorithms that optimize for moral distress and frustration and outrage are always trying to find what will bother us. It could be because, say, the current administration or some kinds of political forces use it as distraction and as a wedge. It could be a kind of Wilhelm Reich issue, right? Reich sort of thought, even though he had sort of conservative ideas about what men and women are, that generally there was a sort of predictable hysteria around anything that had to do with sexuality,
Mm.
whether it was bloodlines or other races or abortion or sodomy or promiscuity or marriage. Like people were always historically freaking out around this small cluster of sexually and reproductive related issues. But I'm curious about how the issue might represent other issues that are being hidden. So I used to live in Victoria, in British Columbia, and I remember one day there was a survey of business owners downtown as to what the biggest issue in the city was, and they all sort of said homelessness. And it's partly because they didn't want homeless people in front of their shops interfering with business, but at the time I thought, I wonder if they feel at home. Like, I wonder if there's a sort of collective phenomenon of rootlessness and ungroundedness, that we're not living where our ancestors lived, right? We're sort of set adrift from the ground, and maybe we project that onto the issue of homelessness. And I wonder if there are other issues that we're projecting onto the issue of trans. And one of those to me is the general and really open-ended and unpredictable issue of life on Earth and human beings in particular gaining some kind of genetic and anatomical control over themselves, that they can remodel themselves. In some ways, I almost feel like transgender is outdated when trans species is already beginning, in the sense that we can reprogram the seemingly natural organic unit that we're in. And I wonder if people who haven't quite grasped that whole trend and the hugely open questions that we're moving into in the future are sort of focused on transgender as the foyer of that discussion. That's where all their anxiety goes around the much bigger question of what is it like to be able to begin to change ourselves as a species.
Mm. Yeah, those are great points. Those are great points. I think there's two directions I want to take that. So one, with the if it's such a small population, why is it such a big deal? I think there's like a handful of good entry points for thinking about that. One is the general way in which we went through a period of time where every single issue of marginalized people was an opportunity to hoard virtue, right? Was an opportunity to gain social capital in the eyes of a particular kind of social relation. Usually for, I don't know if you know, like the PMC thesis, like the idea of
No, what is it?
the political, the professional managerial class.
I
So
know the phrase,
yeah,
but what's the
but like,
thesis?
oh, okay, not the thesis, whatever.
Okay,
That's but the concept. You know the concept,
sure.
right? So I feel as though for some portion of that, which is sort of a mediating force between the higher and lower ends of the economic like system, there was a very real benefit and value to jumping onto the sort of social justice train in order to build yourself up and to build your status and your value as a virtuous member of society who's socially minded and socially conscious. And I think that in part, that part of society is at which like includes not just like people in HR departments, people in universities, people in public relations and all sorts of different places, and in the culture industry, um, but also activists who also sort of like tend to slide into those sorts of roles as well. Um, that for them, these issues presented a means of like being in, like gaining social capital, being involved in projects that were able to sustain them financially and personally, and feeding in then with like the algorithm, feeding in then with like social media and all the other stuff, and the general like woke trend of like culture. I think there became like a glut of information that was like oversaturating the discursive field with like for every single marginalized like community's struggle. It brought way more attention to it than it would have ever had otherwise. People who were definitely not transgender would talk about this stuff all day long, right? And would be deeply invested in a lot of these types of arguments when they don't have any real personal investment in a lot of this stuff. That's one part of how I think that became very like in public consciousness. Another thing is that I feel as though somewhere along the way, transgender activists and other like progressive activists at some point decided that transgender kids was literally the most important transgender issue. And honestly, the ethics of kids transitioning is still up in the air to me. I think that some people take it too lightly. Um, I think that basically, like my general working assumption is that everyone goes through some kind of like gender hell in their teenage years, and that can lead you down a lot of different paths, and there's a lot of confusion in there, and there isn't a lot of space to actually explore that. You know, if you wanted to be a feminine boy in the world, you're gonna have a hard time. You're gonna have a hard time. I wasn't a particularly feminine boy, at least outwardly. Um, but I know people who were and were like mercilessly like uh, attacked on various levels throughout their childhood and teenage years. And so there's a very real tension around coming into a sense of who you are and what it means to be a man or a woman that is inherently confusing and disorienting and uncertain, I think. And so in some of that space, I think that there is legitimate reason to talk about the idea of maybe some kids transitioning. There's also just a lot of space for allowing kids just sort of like, I don't know, play with expression and see where they end up and not be like punish them for it. Um, I sometimes wonder if I had been allowed to simply be feminine and to see myself as beautiful, pretty, as being able to aspire to these sort of like feminine ideals as a child, then I wonder if I would have transitioned. It's actually kind of up in the air, right? Um, but but a lot of people, kids is literally like the sacred cow or something. Like kids are like the thing that we cannot ever really talk about without causing some sort of a fight. Everyone has really strong opinions. Have you heard of the tickle argument? There are people who think tickling kids is abuse, and people who think tickling kids is good, natural, and right. Like, uh, like intense discussions on tickling. Okay, like with kids, everything becomes heightened and intense and like painful. So the fact that people made trans kids the one of the central issues of the popular transgender discourse, I think that is one of the things that really like made people really hyper focus on it. Um, and then of course like the issue of trans women and women in women's spaces is also like a really like touchy subject. So focusing on these particular areas where everyone was kind of touchy is like one thing that I think got it way more attention. Um, but um, the other thing that you point out, which I think is really, 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 really important, is the way that people may be projecting something onto this with regards to their own like uncertainty around what it means to be human moving forward with what we're capable of doing to being human, right? Um, Now, before I go into that, I just want to say when it comes to projecting onto this particular issue, it's funny because like the other day I was actually reading Alenka Zupancic's What is Sex and was thinking a little bit about I have some notes here, but I was thinking a little bit about the ontological negativity of sex or of sexuality and sexual difference, the internally antagonistic nature of these things. And the way that Alenka talks about how, I'll just read my note, culture appears at the point of the negativity of sexuality and goes on to repress this negativity while exploiting and monopolizing the drives. And that, so there is a kind of lack of norm, of a lack prior to the norm, that the norm sort of aims to sort of satisfy through fantasy, maybe one might say. The fantasy of the sexual union, which of course it means a fully constituted man and woman and their roles respective to each other. And but this norm, the establishment of the norm, is generally taken for granted. It's assumed as natural, but it covers up that there is like one might even say like a hole in nature, a gap in nature. And I wrote this other note. We used a metaphor in my reading group about it's like a vase. The norm is like a vase. It sort of structures what is inherently sort of like unstructured. But following from that metaphor, the disturbing thing about the spilling over of the vase is that it highlights that there is a vase, right? That the vase is not fully natural. If the vase was natural and it fully covered the field, there would be no spilling, right? There would be no spilling. So it reveals that the vase is not fully natural. That the vase exists because of what's not there, right? And that's what's I think one of the things that is tricky about not just trans people, but like other issues too, is that when it highlights the way that the norm is not something that can be taken for granted as like inherent and natural, it highlights that there is something under there is the lack of something that the norm is making up for, and that's disorienting. That's disturbing. I feel as though, in some sense, the existence of trans people kind of highlights this. If it's possible for you to identify as something other than your birth sex, it highlights that, oh, wait, we actually have to go through a process of identifying with what our birth sex means. That there isn't some guaranteed meaning to our birth sex in an inherent way. I think that's also potentially disturbing. Um, it entails like, well, what am I and what are you, and what is my relationship to you if what we are isn't really actually like something we can take for granted, which is obviously kind of disturbing. Um, but I feel like this extends further to this issue with like the possibility of transhumanism. That what is human is something we can't take for granted. That we think that what is human to us as it exists now, which is still rather unclear as it is, but the fact that there is some sort of artifice to it is highlighted by the possibility of it being otherwise, right? That we actually aren't sure what being human means and what are the limits of humanity, right? Um, but that we have produced certain limits and certain like regulating ideals that we take for granted and that we assume. And the possibility of changing these things opens up the fact or exposes us to the fact that we actually don't know. And that we kind of know, implicitly, we know that we don't know because we do have limits, we do have norms, we do have ideals. And that's precisely there because we aren't sure what the limits are, what defines the space, right? And that's rather disturbing. Although I think that in the long run, it's the tech, right? It's the tech and the genetic engineering that's going to be the real like flashpoint once that gets to a certain spot. I mean, I think once genetic manipulation and cybernetic augmentation gets advanced enough, no one's going to care about trans people. I just don't think so. Yeah, I think that once those things get big, you'll see more people getting like cybernetic augmentations than you see people getting sex change surgeries.
Yeah, there's a lot more obvious desires and opportunities to modify the body than there are than just appear around sexuality.
Oh yeah.
Like, first of all, everybody's going to want all kinds of health improvements and capacity improvements, and then all kinds of customization play.
Or just look at video games when you're making your avatar.
Yeah.
Extend that to your actual body. Like people will go wild with that. But of course, this also opens up the question, who will be able to do that and who won't?
Sure.
That's an even more disturbing
And I
element.
mean, obviously, it will be concentrated among people who have wealth and technological access at first, but then there will be a spread through the system in various ways, and each layer of that spread will provoke different kinds of results. But one thing you said, talking about the nature of sex and the nature of the human, and that we don't know. But there's a question around who is that we, right? Like, do different people have different requirements relative to believing in the normative success of the vase, whether the vase adequately organizes the chaos of being or not, right?
Mm,
Because there's a one way to think about it is through the model of the early tribe, in which there were some esoteric, sort of more shamanic individuals who were more available to mystery and ambiguity and transformation. They were built in such a way. They had a neurodiversity that made um, the impossibility of capturing all of this in normative structures something they could work with. But there might be a
mm,
lot of other people in the society, in the tribe, for whom that's just not really an option, that they can't successfully organize their energies in any profitable way without believing that the normative structure actually succeeds. And so maybe you get a system in which the people who can see that and tolerate that, they live one way and they participate in the production of, to some degree, fictitious norms for the rest of the population who has to be accepted as not being able to thrive under the conditions of the ambiguity.
mm, mm. Yeah, I'm almost reminded that, but that almost makes you think of as like Plato, the Republic. Like it makes you think of, right, you had the philosopher kings.
Mhm.
Um, but honestly, I'm not sure. I don't know. On some level, my intuitive sympathies are towards the idea of like collective participation in sort of a more or ongoing organic process of reflexive understanding and of myth making, one might say. I don't know about how to think through the idea of like say a class or a group of people who are in charge of say producing such organizing myths. And in many ways, I doubt the shamans of the tribes that you're talking about did it truly by themselves, whether they realized it or not. You know, it's even at a distance from from the people. You come from the people, and you still engage with most of the time the people around you in the tribe. You're not usually completely isolated, right? Or else no one would even know they existed to begin with. Um, and I can't help but think one is always involved in the collective myth making in that way, right? So
Yeah.
even if there are people who maybe have this capacity to work with the ambiguity and to engage creatively and productively with the myth making that other people can kind of live under, the idea of them doing it consciously as a group for the others seems a little perverse to me, I think. I think there's a
Yeah,
more
I don't think it fits the organic complexity of human social organization to
yeah.
just right. I mean, there's a way that it's provocative to think in terms of an esoteric and an exoteric
Mm,
population, but there's intermediaries, and there's a way in which all of these people have the same kinds of functions but distributed in different balances. So even if some people are 80% the shamans, a whole bunch of other people might be 15% the shamans, and they're collectively orchestrating something together.
mm,
And yet, I think it is, and of course, they ought to be, in my view, free to adjudicate the distance that each of them holds relative to the ruptures of reality. And because
mm,
that it might even change for an individual over time or under different contexts and circumstances. But
mm,
it does seem like we can't just, like, there's a utopian danger in assuming that we could all be made equally subject to the impossibility of the success of our norms.
mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, I think that that's true. I think that that's true. Um, but the way that that emerges within social relations, right? I think that is like the silent weaving, you know. I feel like, for instance, I talk to people and they talk to people and they talk to people and I give my opinions and I share my ideas and my love of philosophy. And everything trickles down in some strange way. And who knows what effects what the things I've told people will have on them, their kids, and their kids' kids down the line. And in some way, like threads can be transmitted through generations. What did I get from my grandfather? What did I get from my dad and my dad's dad? You know? Um, so, um, but you're right that not everyone, I think, is nor should they deal with this sort of like inherent impossibility that sort of like contaminates reality. I don't think that that's something most people can really like actively work with on a day-to-day basis. And even me, I work with it here and there in some sense, reading philosophy and stuff. But like, it's not like I'm not dealing with it when I'm like making dinner.
These conversations we record are usually about 90 minutes, but how are you feeling? You want to do another half hour or do you want to wrap this up?
No, yeah, I'm good for another half hour.
All right, let's do it. One of the things I've been thinking about in terms of norms, one of the norms we tend to use is just the notion of masculine and feminine, of like a complementary duality, right? And there are people who exaggerate that in the yin yang sense of thinking, oh, there's something about the complementarity of forces at every layer of the cosmos that's sort of captured by the way we think about male and female themes. And then there's usually a counter argument, which is, first of all, that's never going to capture anything, and there's always a gradient. And why are we looking at two rather than three or four or, the square root of -1 or any other number of categories? And I relate that to something that I sometimes think of in terms of the the stack of potential gendered levels within an individual. Because I find that a lot of the discussion flattens it out. Like there's either male and female or there's not. And it seems like, well, you could be chromosomally male or female, and you could be anatomically male or female, and you can be neurohormonally male and female, and then you can socially present as male or female. And why don't we just have the full stack of those on our driver's license so that, yes, if I'm unconscious and the doctor needs to operate on me, he needs to know one thing, and if you're dealing with me verbally, you need to know another. And so there are ways in which we could enrich and enhance the male female notion, but there's other ways in which it will always be insufficient to capture the full richness of being. How do you relate to, the notion of male female, the whole yin yang kind of dynamic in general?
Well, so I mean, the most uh, primordial notion of male and female is associated with right active and passive, right? But I mean, that's so easy to complicate. That is so easy to complicate. Like what appears as active could be passive in some respect, right? Like say that a guy thinks he has to make the first move. He might be like in dating or whatever. He might be taking action, but he could be passive relative to the norms, right? So he's not actively engaging in the very norms he's performing. So in that sense, there's a passivity. Not only that, there's also his relationship to the object of his desire, which he might be actually like passively absorbed by, in a way that is unreflective and not active. So in another sense, too, passivity can be very active. One can appear passive as a means of asserting agency over a situation. One can very well be crafting an image or appearance which is only meant to sit there, but it influences everything around it, right? And what appears as though it's just like when people say, "Oh, she looks so natural," right? Well, but is it? Because sometimes that natural look is actually quite an artifice, either through cosmetics, surgeries, and also like makeup and whatnot. So, or that's cosmetics. What am I talking about? So, like, it can appear nothing can actually be the product of a lot of activity. Um, so that's just one example of this, right? Like there's all these means by which we can complicate the associations we draw from masculine and feminine, and the way we can implicate one into the other. Um, I think that when we start talking about other things, things get a bit more concrete. That at that level of mystical abstraction, I think things can be broken down and complicated really easily. But things start to get a bit more interesting and concrete when we start talking about, say, embodiment and social symbolic positioning. Like this is one of those things that for me has been very interesting because taking hormones does change quite a bit. Um, but so does appearing as the other sex or appearing as the other gender and being seen as the other gender. Like I've had a lot of people in the last, maybe more so in the last year than than when I first started transitioning. But I've had several people who've been like, "Oh, I really just I see you as a woman. I see you as a woman." And it's like, "Well, that's cool. I mean, like I sometimes do." Like it's not always consistent, you know? I mean, I don't really see myself as a man, but like it's hard to be like feel like absolute certainty like, "Oh yeah, I'm just a woman like any other gal." But there's some people who when they meet me, they're like, "Oh yeah, yeah. You're just feminine. You're one of the gals. I can see it, right?" And it's like, "Oh, you can see it, huh? Wow, that's nice for you. Great for you." Um, but like socio-symbolic positioning is fascinating in that respect, since like it's actually kind of external, but it becomes internalized as well. I know, like I said, for some trans people, like they have this really strong inner sense of what they are, right? And I didn't come from that place. I came from a really weak sense of what I am on the inside. Um, and it's through the social that I gain better perspective of myself and what I am and my relationship to myself through the social, as well as my relationship to the social field. Um, but what's fascinating is that like there are changes in my perception, changes in my thinking that it's hard to tease apart from what was the hormones and what was the social symbolic positioning. Like for instance, when I started hormones, I began to experience emotions a little bit differently. I think that their emotions have a more visceral effect on me. Like, I don't think I'm any more or less sad or happy or angry or any of that stuff. But the effect it has on my body, on my somatic sort of sense of being, is different. Like when I am sad, it is I cry way more easily. I feel it in my body way more like intensely, but also sometimes less more short-lived. Like it maybe not always as it doesn't always carry on as long, especially if it's not a deep wound, you know? Um, I would say anger actually is a little bit of a weaker uh sense in me. But like it never was very strong to begin with. Another question, right? Like, was that always there or is it changed? You know, I know a lot of guys who, when they get angry, they get scary. You know, they have a hard time dealing with the visceral bodily, like feeling of anger. And they're not sure how to deal with it. They're not sure how to express it, and it can sort of take them over. I was never like that. Uh, I've always had a really like uh soft spoken and gentle disposition. Now, is that feminine? And in that sense, was I always feminine in that way? Or is it? Aren't there plenty of guys who are gentle and soft spoken and who are able to like manage their anger really well? Like there's tendencies and there's commonalities, but it seems as though as soon as you try to say, okay, this is like characteristic of,
Yeah.
then you've got the exception or you've got something that breaks the rule. But
The hormone thing is so intriguing, and I think it, I mean, first of all, it interferes with the whole idea of of what the purpose of keeping trans women out of sports is, out of girls' sports, because every kind of girl could have a different hormonal balance, right? And she could have a different body structure created by different hormonal balance, not necessarily because she's trans, but because these chemicals in us create different kinds of effects physically, emotionally, and particularly I'm interested in the sense making, right? You were just speaking to the way that emotion might be processed differently and the ambiguity of determining whether that's a response to the chemistry of the hormones or whether it's an unfolding of your own thinking and self experience in some ways.
Yeah.
Uh, my friend Rachel
Also,
Hayden, who co hosted the Parallax Occultism course that I did, said that feminizing hormones made her worse at reading maps but better at recognizing landmarks. And I'm curious whether your like the way you map the world feels like it's changed or is changing.
I don't know. I honestly, I don't think so, or it's not something that stands out to me. I would say I was always relatively, like, like, I always use maps for everything, and I'm really bad at landmarks. I'm really bad with visual memory, but I'm good with I'm better with like systematized abstract sort of representations of things. So, it's much easier for me to get around. Like I'll rely on my Google Maps like all the time. Like if I'm driving, it's difficult for me to use like what's I'm visually in front of me. But like I don't think that's changed much from prior to taking the hormones. So that's not something I think that I can account for in myself. But there are a few other things that maybe are kind of interesting. Like hmm, like for instance, here's one thing, like sexuality. I would say that sexuality has changed since I started transitioning. I was like probably 80% attracted to women and maybe 20% attracted to men prior to transitioning. And I'd say now it's more like a 40-60, or maybe a 50-55-45, but like with slightly more attracted to men. Um, but I'm also strangely like I became more attracted to other trans women, which honestly feels more homosexual than any other kind of attraction. And which I know for some trans women, just saying that would be invalidating, right? Because trans women are women, right? So the idea that it would be uniquely homosexual to be attracted to other trans women sets trans women apart from other women. But like I have a difference in the way that I'm affected by different people, and that's just how that is, right? The question though is how much of that is hormones and how much of that is socio-symbolic positioning? And that is also true with the emotions thing too. Let's not rule out the possibility that self-conception has an effect on my own somatic experiences. I would I would say that it's really hard to narrow down what is belongs to one category of change and what belongs to another category of change. What I can say for sure, Dove seems as though it's related to the hormones, is that there is a qualitative change in my experience of sexuality and in the way and in what context and what kinds of like situations that I experience arousal. Like that has actually changed, and I think that one of the things that like affected that was actually taking progesterone. It seems like progesterone has some kind of effect on the modality or the qualitative sort of particularity of like the arousal process or of sexuality in some way. Um, but there's also it's still not clear, you know? There aren't a lot of tests on this stuff. I haven't seen a lot of research on these things. I'm only going off of anecdote and my own experiences. Like one good example, like male sexuality for me felt very like object focused, felt very like anticipatory, like I'm gonna get the thing or whatever, right? and also had like a kind of very fixed obsessiveness to it, if that makes sense. Um, which, I took for granted as a man, and which I like maybe didn't really sit with me well even at that time. But with now when I reflect on it, because it's much less that way. Like I used to watch porn and stuff, and I used to like be into like certain like say fetishy stuff or whatever. So like so many guys out there. That lost a lot of appeal. Not for lack of trying. I didn't expect those changes. And that's one of the things that tells me something really changed. Because, I didn't expect those things. I wasn't looking for those things, right? So these changes in the way and what's arousing, how it's arousing, and like how to respond to things, how to play with that energy, that like changed, and I had to like relearn stuff. So something about that really there really is some kind of different mode from what I was used to. And I'm inclined to think it's the hormones, but it's still not 100% sure, you know? Maybe it has something to do with a more deeply rooted subjective like structure, you know? Like for instance, just in terms of getting the object versus being the object, or of being a body in relative to another rather than their body relative to me as an agent, right? Like there those sorts of things, and like you see a lot if you like look at like women's fantasies and stuff. A lot of times there is like a being there and a being having all the action happening around her, like women's like erotic novels. Um, So there's some kind of difference there, and it might be related to hormones, but also might be related to something more structural in the psyche. And in that respect, I kind of think I tend to try to look towards Lacan's formulas of sexuation to sort of like get a better idea of what's going on there. Um, but that is really tricky. It's such a complex topic, Lacan's sexuation. But I think that the schemas and the logic that's in there seems to relate to some of this on some level.
All
But
of
is that
this is,
hormonal? But is it hormonal, or is it like your
yeah,
position in the social field and in the symbolic order? Like what is it?
like given that we can't quite tell that, and that fundamentally the difference between those might not be as stark as we usually consider, like objective and subjective are blurry at certain degrees. But I think there's a field of inquiry right here that is fascinating, and I basically hear not discussed anywhere else. Like becoming a beginner again with the constellating of desire and pleasure, and what it's like, particularly with another person, with your fiance. You're like, how does your shift from aiming at the object to being in a more ambiguous relationship of being the object, or aiming at the object and holding polarities, how does all of that, like, what is it like to be, to have, in some ways, have lived a human life doing it one way, and now starting again with all this ambiguity, being back at
Hard.
square one in terms of figuring out how to desire and take pleasure?
It's difficult. I've had to learn a lot with my fiance, and she has too, you know? She's not like some stone butch lesbian or something, you know? She considered herself pansexual prior, but she'd only ever been with men. And when we were together, it was kind of the typical way was that we would get close. I would get the itch to get a little, handsy or to get a little playful. And then it turns to this and that, and all of a sudden we're doing it, you know? And it's on my end, not that she's not playing a role. I mean, she's still being there. Once again, what appears as passive can be very active, right? She's still being there and inviting in the play of energy, right? But I was always the one who sort of, crossed that line, and not in a bad way, but like where the boundary starts to blur is sort of would like make the move inward and we would begin to sort of mesh, right, in that intimate encounter. Once I started taking hormones, at first I didn't even experience this change in modality. My sexuality just went dead. I didn't feel this need to do that, that itch to like cross the line, to like start taking it in and playing with her. That's just, it wasn't there in the same way. It was really sort of difficult because there just wasn't that drive or that pulse, that force that brings me into that space. So then we like were having a pretty hard time at that point because she had no idea how to do what I was doing. And it was such a subtle thing, right? Because once two people get started, I mean, they're both kind of pretty active and engaged with each other. But in the initiatory phase, there tends to be a pattern, and it's usually not equal. It can be uneven. And like she was not used to playing that sort of role of being the one who sort of performs desire, one might say. And so it took quite a while for us to eventually get going. Especially because, like I said, at the time, I didn't even have a different modality. My sexuality just sort of like, the way I think of it is like this. If you think of it as a polarity of a more masculine sexual mode and a feminine sexual mode, when I started hormones and my testosterone tanked, it didn't immediately jump to the other side. It like went to null first before then passing into a different mode. There's a lot of, if you go on Reddit, there's a lot of trans people who will talk about this, or specifically trans women. For trans men, things are different. Testosterone's a hell of a drug in terms of turning up the horny. So they have a different story, which is also very interesting to hear. And, but as someone who started off coming from the male perspective, you know, it one of the things that's a problem too is that I'm sure like for a lot of guys, the idea of having a libido and being virile and like having the energy to like go at it or whatever, like that's like a big thing. To lose that is like can be very painful. It could be a feeling of like you really lost something, like you really lack something. And there was a little of that for me. There was like am I broken? Am I ruined? Like, um, what's gonna happen to my relationship? Like, um, and so, but there, over time, there's this slow process of learning what works, what actually sort of brings that energy back into play and how to sort of get there. Both with me and my fiance, we both had to learn to do things differently. Um, like it's never it's never certain if it's gonna even like go in that direction, but we've developed ways of understanding how to read each other and how to move into that sort of intimate space. And it's definitely not the same as it used to be, but it's we've gotten it working again, if that makes any sense. Another interesting thing is, and it's funny because like there's this part in Zizek's Hegel and the Wired Brain where he like goes off for like a like the end of a paragraph on like the good of non-simultaneous orgasms. And I'm like, that's my life now is non-simultaneous orgasms. Because we have to switch focus. Like we can't both be focusing in that way at the same time. It just does not work anymore in that way. Um, I could go. I don't know if it's TMI, but like just if I could just mention this for as an example of what I'm talking about. For some trans women, they no longer like if they keep their genitals, they are no longer able to get a full erection. So like the ability to even have penetrative sex is lost. Uh, I'll say that. I won't say where I'm at. I'm not gonna. I feel like that would be a little obscene, but like, but that is. that is a thing. That is a thing. So like you have to figure out other ways to make it work. And in that way, though, I think that especially for me and my partner, it's really strengthened our relationship in some sense because, right, like we're both coming from a place of love for each other, first and foremost, right? And the making sex work, which is funny because Linka Zupancic in What is Sex says sex is that which does not work, right? Um, like I feel that really strongly. But it's through love and our continuous desire to be in a mode of desiring with each other is what has sort of allowed us to try to make it work and figure out what feels good, which is still something I'm working on, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. How about you ask me some questions?
Let's see here. How did you get into a lot of the like philosophy and mysticism stuff?
I was instinctively oriented toward um, magic, spirituality, and religion pretty much as early as I can remember. And that drove me to all of the different ancient and contemporary voices on the subject. So I spent a lot of, like my 20s being a Christian or being a Buddhist or, being a serious contemplative meditation practitioner and yogi and things like that. But it became obvious that there were richer ways to think about that. And that there were contemporary voices, or at least voices from the last 200 years, that nuance the metaphysical assumptions of how we approach all that stuff. Even if those practices and those kind of communities are still really valuable, they're very simplistic in how they think about what we are and what's the highest value and how do we identify things and what is consciousness and all these other kinds of interesting questions. So I ended up finding certain kinds of communities, integral, meta modern, game B, that kind of stuff, where there was space to play in both the serious inner practice zone and the civilization transforming new philosophy zone.
Mm.
um, and Yeah, that's basically it. I mean, it just seemed very natural to me. It was in terms of the spirituality and contemplating world pictures and just always digging and trying to make things more complicated. That's just the pleasure that I've taken in my life the whole time.
Mm.
But I think a big part of it was that I came out of an educated household. Like we lived really rural, but we had books, we had magazines, and you were allowed to pursue anything in conversation that you wanted. There were no limits on what we could explore in the social space of the household.
Mm. See that's great. That's great. I feel like I feel I relate to that very strongly because my dad, who was not really an intellectual, but like he was raised Jehovah's Witness, and his dad was really into like reading books on theology. And although he left Jehovah's Witness, my dad became non-denominational Christian. He continued reading, and a lot of it still kind of related to Jehovah's Witness. He never fully left some of their views, but he was him and his dad would talk for hours and hours and hours, and they were very thoughtful and well-spoken people. My dad, when he had us with my mom is ex-Catholic, and she's like, "That's all a book of fairy tales. I don't want my kids being forced to learn that stuff, but it's okay to talk about it." So we were able to be in a space where I could talk to my dad about religion, about God, about human life and ethics and virtue and like what's our place in the universe and what is the nature of God? How do angels function in like a place in all this? How does the devil? What is demons? Like how does all this fit in this metaphysical cosmological perspective? I could talk about all this stuff with him. I never had to believe it though. I was never forced to be like, okay, that is the way it is. So it was all open to speculation. It was all open to consideration. It was all open to experimentation. And so that, I think, for me at least, was the big entryway to thinking metaphysically and philosophically.
Yeah.
I have another question for you.
Okay.
What did you want to be when you were a little boy?
Um, I went through these phases that were very interesting. Like early on, I wanted to be a pirate, wanted to be a detective, wanted to be a soldier, and it seemed to me that I was like booting up a potential role and then checking it against the society. Like, all right, pirate. I'm like, oh, there's no real opportunity to be a pirate. So you let that one go. And then you'd be like, okay, I could be a soldier, but there isn't a war that my country is fighting right now. So then you let that one go. And it's like I was moving along this set of options that were built in. And because there was no uh, external need for me to lock in one of those options, I was allowed to just keep migrating to the next one and to the next one and to the next one. And where I ended up was, although the detective thing influenced this a little bit, I think probably, around 10 or 11, I started to think, oh, I want to be a supernatural detective, right? I had various there's Harry D'Amour in these Clive Barker novels, and there was Dirk Gently, and there was Fox Mulder, and there was Dale Cooper on Twin Peaks. I had these examples of people who were, it's like they were investigators, but their investigations strayed across multiple types of ontology. And I thought that's basically what I want to be. Even though I was constantly writing and everybody else related to me as if I was going to be either an intellectual or a writer of some kind. Mostly what I wanted to be was a multidimensional detective of some kind. And then slowly over time, I started to think, oh, this is kind of like saying you want to be a shaman. And I got very much into religious communities of various kinds. But even while I was there being very sincere, I always thought things like, okay, but what if I had to reinvent the Dharma myself on a desert island? Like, what if I didn't have any of this institutional input? What's a more organic regeneration of all of these things? So I became
Mm.
increasingly aware that I'd actually been skewed the whole time towards personal experiential regenerating of something like spirituality, and that it didn't matter to me how we called that, what we thought about it. It was an existential procedure that was always being regenerated in each epoch or each kind of
Mm.
ideological world space.
That's fascinating. I really like vibe with that idea that, like, for instance, you can come to certain profound truths not merely through the legacy of other thinkers, but that the very legacy itself is founded on certain root commonalities or universals of our own existential being in the world that you can draw on to generate these sorts of this knowledge about oneself, the world, and its relations, um, from the ground up, in any circumstance, given the right conditions. So,
Yeah, I think especially once we take the subconscious seriously, we think whether we're thinking about psychologically or neurologically, most of our processing is not in the sort of conscious foyer of the mind.
mm,
And you go, okay, so then most of whatever would really be religion or spirituality or self-development or whatever we mean by all those things is not a conscious person says some truths and another conscious person receives them and remembers them and acts on them. Because that's such a tiny piece of our intelligence that the whatever's really going on in terms of human growth is something mostly hidden from an individual communicates to another individual's mostly hidden parts and stimulates their own possibilities for the production of wisdom. Wisdom isn't something where you just send it across to the other. It's something you encourage the other to generate themselves. And like that's the mode of transmission.
mm, mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's see. I have another question. What, how do I put this? Um, what do you think most other people think about where we are moving as a species?
My sense is that most people imagine that we are doing one of two things, either straying into utopia dystopia, which is to say we're everything's going to be wrecked, or we've figured out everything and it's going to be great, but like some conjunction of those two, maybe even they happen at the same time.
Mm,
Or they think we're in a period of anomaly and eventually we're going to renormalize, that the old natural customs are going to come back. And my sense is neither of those are quite correct. Like, first of all, um, the dystopic thinking and the utopian thinking are exaggerated and they don't really take into account the plurality of simultaneous mutant outcomes and sheer surprises that we're going to face. But I think the sense that modernity, and in particular this period of late hyper-modernity or wherever we are, is a blip that's going to renormalize, doesn't take seriously, first of all, how normality and naturalness is actually generated, but also the fact that we're um, straying into territories that are kind of formally nonlinear and undecidable, and not just because our artists and shamans and philosophers are open to mystery, but because technologically we're starting to grapple with patterns that can't be reduced to things that are recognizable in the ordinary way.
mm,
So I think we're sort of institutionalizing surprise and ambiguity, in physics, in production, in computers, maybe even at the level of political organization and things like that. And that doesn't allow us, that's not a return. It's a movement forward into high strangeness of some kind.
mm. Yeah. Just that reminds me of something I think about sometimes, or I've been thinking about lately, which is that the way in which the hybrid of the digital and the like actual physical spatial sort of space for social relations to sort of actually happen, I think is just beginning. Like the possibility for social interactions and genuine social events to take place on like in the liminal space between online and offline is something that has not been fully developed and is like really going to radically change your understanding of what it means to be social.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a number of things that we imagine that we get, but we barely seen them starting yet. I think the sort of
Mm,
teasing apart of sexuality and reproduction is something that we think we get because the tools are a few generations old. I think we know what the noosphere is, and I don't think we've barely even seen its beginning yet. The guy that created the Gaia hypothesis, James Lovelock, wrote this book called Novacene, and basically he said AIs are going to populate the noosphere. The humans are just the beginning of that process, and I think it's similar with the interpenetration of the real and the virtual, or the real and the supermediated.
mm,
Like we think because we've had TV for a couple generations, or people have grown up knowing what reality TV is and having portable recording devices, that we know what it is, but it hasn't even begun. You have to imagine what it's like 50, 100, 300 years down the line when that thing we experience as the strangeness between the real and the unreal is massively amplified and proliferated to the point where we can't find anything outside of it. And we become like, what mutations occur when we become fully indigenous to that hybrid space?
mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a fascinating place for thinking about a history that has yet to be written, but that you can see the seeds of it.
I think, I'm sure Bruce is watching this edit and would like us to wrap this up.
Oh, yeah.
But I think um, the experiments, right? However authentic people might feel them to be, but the experiments of the trans people show us a very interesting piece, not only of what human nature has been all along, but also of the new strangeness that's beginning to unfold. And I think we've barely begun to be interested enough in what's going on in that phenomenon for it to tell us something important. So I really appreciate this discussion. I appreciate the nuance and the philosophical intimations that you bring to it, and the admirably complex way that you're holding yourself and everything that you're going through. Thank you for this, Rebecca.
For sure. I'd also just like to say that when it comes to the kinds of like very valuable thinking that can come out of the like transgender experience, like of everything, like there are some really fascinating metaphysical and especially ontological questions relating to both embodiment and desire and sexuality that I haven't even like that we in this conversation haven't even begun to like really flesh out. So if anyone's really interested, like there is still plenty to think through, and it's not just applicable to transgender people. It I really would can't stress it enough that I really think that at the root, the experiences of transgender people and the sort of philosophical implications of that absolutely have a lot of meaning for the norm or for people who are cisgendered. I'm not even sure if I like the term cisgendered, but like people who aren't trans, like there are philosophical implications for them, not just us, and that we can work together to think through the foundation of what it means to be human and what it means to be sexed moving forward into the future.